This is a really quick video about how to use the Network tab in your web browser developer tools to debug an application. I'm just using actually a student version of this single page application in the reset password homework. The app does have an error in it on the server side, but I want to show you how you can kind of determine whether the error is something that's happening on the server versus something that's happening in the network connection by using the Network tab. And it also just gives you a better understanding of what's going on behind the scenes when you're sending requests back and forth to your RESTful API. So I've already opened the application. I'm running a server in another process. And the first thing I want to do is open the developer tools, which there's a shortcut for it that you should probably learn. It's different on different platforms, but you can also find it in the hamburger menu here. So under More Tools, Developer Tools, again, just learn the shortcut because that makes it a lot easier to get here quickly. So this is going to open up a new window on my browser that has access to all of the various tools in the developer toolkit. There's a bunch of different things in here that are all worth learning because they can be helpful in different situations, but I want to focus just on the Network tab. Because I opened this window up after loading this initial page, I'm not seeing any traffic in here. In order to see something, I've got to actually have this open while I'm interacting with the server. So I'll just reload the page. And you can see we get a number of messages back and forth between the server and the browser to load the application into memory again. And since that's not what I'm focusing on, I'm just going to delete these for the time being. If you want to do this and go drill into some of these other requests, it is really instructive to see what's going on in detail, but that's not what I want to focus on. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new account on this database. So I'm going to push the sign up button here, and what we're going to see is that that's going to result in a request to the server. And that's what's reflected over here in the Network tab. So we see it's got a URL of accounts, and it tells us just some summary information that it actually worked. But more interestingly, we can actually drill down inside of this and see some of the details of this request and the response that came back. The various sections of this headers tab show us just some general information about the progress and status of the request. So we sent a request to this endpoint, right? That corresponds to the route in our happy server. We used a post request. We got a status code back of 200. So this is just really general purpose information. We can also see that the payload that we sent, so we filled out this form, we gathered those 4 fields, and then the payload that we created was a JSON object that we sent out over Axios in this case. And you can see here that the various property names and values are as we expect in the payload. In addition to the payload itself, our request also included some headers, some of which are added by Axios, some of which are created by the browser, others we can influence by our code itself. But one of the interesting things in here is the content type, which says, hey, this request has a payload that consists of JSON data, and the way we say that is application/JSON. And there's a bunch of standard content types. If you Google for MIME, M-I-M-E types, you'll find a big list of them. And in this case, we're just saying we're sending you some JSON data. And on the server side, the server is going to look at this content type header and choose to decode it according to this specification here that says, hey, this is JSON. Once the server gets hold of this, then of course it's going to dispatch a route handler, access the database, do whatever it's going to do, and send a response back. And we can also get access to the response. So the obvious place to go look for that is in this response tab. And this is literally the body of the response message that came back from the server. And this should look familiar in that our responses, at least for this sample code, are all just a JSON object that contains 2 properties: an OK property that's either true or false, depending on whether it worked or not, and a message property that has a string that we can then use to notify the user of what happened. So this created account is exactly what's being displayed in the pop-up here inside the application. This is sometimes a little bit hard to read if the response is more elaborate than that. So the Preview tab takes the response and attempts to format it in a little bit friendlier way. So recognizing that this is a JSON response, the Preview tab grabs that and reformats it as a nice JSON object and lets us drill down into the contents of it. Back on the headers side, we can see, in addition to these request headers that we sent, we also got some headers back from the server. And here's another example of the use of that content type header. It says that the content in the response was also application/JSON. And that's how the preview tab knows to decode this raw response as a JSON object and be able to display it so we can have easier access to it in the developer tools. Okay, let's try another request. So now that we've signed up, let's sign in. And we are now logged in. We can see that we've got our drop-down menu with our name in it. We've got a new button here to allow us to reset our password now that we're logged in. And we can look at the login request just like before. So here in the headers tab, we can see the general information about what endpoint we sent our request to. This can be really helpful just to make sure the basic tracks line up between the client and the server. It's a post request again, and we get a 200 response back. And we can see that the request payload, the outbound information from the client to the server, from the browser to the server, contain these two fields as we type them into the form. And then the preview of the response has a little bit more in it now, because remember, when we log into our little single page application, we're sending back more detailed account information to be able to display things like the user's first name and to keep track of the fact that somebody's logged in. So the additional information besides the OK and the message elements in this response are the details property that contains another nested object whose properties correspond to the information about this currently logged in user. We can go here and get a list of current accounts. So there's a longer list of information, and if we look here inside the accounts tab, the preview that's showing us the results of this request shows now an array of multiple accounts that are all embedded JSON objects inside of this. So we can see that this raw data is coming from the server as a result of our API request, and then it's being used to format the information here. Finally, let's try to use this reset password functionality. So we're going to come here and type in our old information. And then hit the reset button. Now if we just look over here in the network tab again, we see that the reset password request was sent to the appropriate endpoint on the server, and that it includes our email address, our old password, and our new password. So we can have a fair amount of confidence here that we're actually sending the request that we think we're sending, and that the issue that might be happening would be something that's taking place on the server side. Now remember, there's sort of two main places where errors can be detected on the server. For those endpoints where we're using Joy to verify the inbound payload or other parts of the request, if those validators fail, Joy is going to tell Happy, hey, this is just a bogus request, go ahead and send an error response back to the client. In that case, our code's never even being invoked because the request has been deemed invalid. One thing to check is to make sure that these elements in the request payload match up with the validation that we have in place on the server side for this endpoint. If that appears to be the case, then the next place to look is inside the handler itself to see where our own code might have gone off the tracks. And in fact, in this case, the code that I'm demonstrating here is doing some unnecessary checking to make sure that there's two passwords that match on the server side, even though that's not really necessary in this case because we've already verified it on the client side. But the point here is that you can use this tool to try to verify sort of where in the process things might have gone off the tracks. The request is going out, we're getting a response back from the server that indicates that something actually ran in our code because we're actually creating this message. And the fact that we're seeing a 200 status means that Happy and Joy in general were happy with this request and sent you back a normal response. Whereas if they had decided that the contents of the payload was invalid according to the validators, it never would have even run our code, and so we'd never have seen this type of a response coming back. This is one way to use the network tab in the debugging tools to help you figure out what's going on in an application. Definitely a helpful tool to have at your disposal when you're working on an application like this.